Welcome back. I'm visiting here today with Don Howard. Welcome to today's show.
Thanks for having me, Alan.
So, Don, for the listeners here, can you give some background of what led you up to where you are today?
Well, first, let me start with where I am today. For the listeners to know, I have the privilege of leading one of California's oldest philanthropic institutions, the James Irvine Foundation. We do grant making here in California, about $100 million a year, to address income inequality in our state and ensure that low-wage workers have the power to advance economically. It's been a long journey to get there. I would say my personal backstory really resembles like that of so many Americans, of sort of a traditional immigration story. My grandmother came here at age 19 with reportedly $10 in her pocket through Ellis Island and came here for a better future for her and her family. And she worked very, very hard to amass a small savings, and that savings allowed my mom to go to college. And that allowed me then to take the next step in our journey as a family. My mom was a single mom, 2 kids. She worked a ton to save the money needed for us to get an education, and she just drilled that into our head from day one. And then I got quite a lucky break and was admitted to Stanford, and that just changed the trajectory of my family and our economic prospects quite dramatically. But she also drilled in, as a Depression-era child, my mother drilled into my head that I needed to get a job. And I had the clear mandate going to college that I was looking for a career in addition to a good general education. I embraced engineering. I was industrial engineering at Stanford, and similarly got on a track to be a management consultant because that was a good job. Not because it particularly sung to my heart or was something I was exceedingly passionate about. It was an awesome learning experience and a wonderful network building experience. I worked at a firm called Booz Allen and Hamilton, one of the larger consulting firms. They sponsored me to go back to business school, and I went to Stanford and continued as a consultant after that opportunity, until at which I sort of woke up and asked myself, gosh, now that you've done everything that your mom encouraged you to do, what do you really, really want to do with your life? And I began a bit of a journey. It took me about 3 years to reposition myself into mission-driven work. I started by that journey by taking a leave from Booz Allen to join a program modeled off the Peace Corps. It's called the MBA Enterprise Corps. And I spent the better part of 2 years in Poland as a volunteer business consultant after the wall came down and the economy transitioned to a market economy. And I got the bug for helping other folks, and the work that I did. Came back to San Francisco in the midst of the HIV epidemic and hitting my community quite hard, and took up grassroots activism as a sort of nighttime avocation alongside my daytime work. I returned to Booz Allen for a third stint, and it had probably the sole person at Booz Allen who by night was wild-eyed activist with my picket signs, and by day was trying to advise energy and chemicals companies on their strategy. That led me ultimately into nonprofit work in the management consulting field. Bain and Company, another management consulting firm, was starting a nonprofit subsidiary called the Bridgespan Group. I joined early on and became the head of the San Francisco office of Bridgespan, where I was for about 11 years.
Tremendous background. But I want to roll back to your mom. 2 kids?
2 kids,
coming
me and my
over
sister.
Here. Did she immediately come to the West Coast? Was there a stop on the East Coast for a bit?
So it was my grandmother who came from Italy. She immigrated, and she was on the East Coast for the bulk of her life. She only spoke broken English. She managed to, over the course of, she's quite the entrepreneur. She bought and sold houses on the East Coast. She had 6 kids. Tough life. She had 11 pregnancies, 6 live births. But the 6 kids worked really hard with her to basically flip houses back in the 40s and 50s. And that led to a small savings. And ultimately, it was my mom who came to the West Coast seeking a better life and a land of milk and honey. Came out to California during a teacher shortage and started working as a teacher.
How old were you?
So at that point, I wasn't born yet. My mom came here before I was born, and was in California for About 3 or 4 years. She did a little stint overseas for an aerospace company, met my dad in Germany. They had my sister there. My sister's about 3 years older than I am. And then returned to suburban Southern California, Anaheim. And I was born in the city of Orange in 1963.
It's a tremendous background, and you've seen a variety of things in life. But I'm up against the break right now. But I want to, when I get back, I want to talk a little about your transition into the nonprofit sector with the Irvine Foundation.
Happy to.
Visiting here today with Don Howard of the Irvine Foundation. We'll be right back after these messages.
Grandpa, can we do chemistry? Papa, Daddy. Grandpa, let's do something fun.
We'll help you stay organized so you can focus on what really matters in life. Give us a call today and see how we can help you start saving taxes. Welcome back. I'm visiting here today with Don Howard of the Irvine Foundation. Don, you have a tremendous experience, an educational background out of Stanford, graduate degree, moved into the private sector consulting. You moved through, some top-tier firms, and then transitioned into the nonprofit sector. Why?
As I said, I realized through to my early career that I really was living out my mom's sort of sense of what the American dream was. What she believed was that it was about economic security and financial stability. And when I'd gotten to the point after an MBA at Stanford and 8 or so years in management consulting, I realized I probably could count on my next paycheck. I wasn't going to go hungry. And I think that opening really led me to be more to really question my own motivation and ask what really were my values, not my mom's values, or how do I build on her values? And to me, to whom much is given, much is expected. I think that was really reinforced at Stanford as a sort of leadership philosophy. And I also grew up Catholic in Catholic schools. Just had a tremendous sense of service and commitment and obligation. And as I said, my real pivot into mission-driven work was around the HIV epidemic. And I think it was Margaret Mead who said, it takes a small group of folks to change the world, or expect that they can. And what I saw in the work I was doing around HIV activism was just how important it was for a community to stand up, to expect elected representatives to serve them well, and to demand change if it wasn't happening. And a lot of real systems and policy changes happened during the 90s that now spread throughout our healthcare system. The way we develop drugs, the way we price drugs, the way patients are involved in research, all came from activism that happened during the HIV epidemic. And it was that kernel of an observation that led me to think I should be doing this for my profession, not just in my spare time. And really fortuitously, and I do think fortune shines on the well-prepared, or whatever that saying is, as Bain was starting a nonprofit subsidiary, I was almost, tailor-made for the role right out of central casting. I had this background of 8 years or so at Booz Allen, and I had this experience in the nonprofit sector and mission-driven work, and I was able to bring those together to then advise other nonprofit leaders how to scale their impact, and importantly, how to work with funders like foundations. One of my clients was the Irvine Foundation. I got to know the CEO there, had known the CEO previously, but got to know him quite well. And he ultimately invited me to join as the lead on the grant-making work, sort of the number 2, back in 2013, right as my kids were being born.
How big is the James Irvine Foundation?
So Mr. Irvine left. He owned, at the time, back in 1937, a swath of land in Orange County that was 8 miles of coastline, 20 miles inland, if you can imagine, all centered around, sort of Newport Beach. And he left half of the ranch to benefit the people of California. We divested in the 70s. The endowment's now about $2.5 billion. And we do grant making of about $105 million a year at this point.
In the grant making sector and your focus, so this is where you spend your time, your day job.
Mm-hmm.
What constitute on the criteria something that that the Irvine Foundation wants to become involved with?
So we are a little unusual in the world of philanthropy in that we have one singular goal as an institution, which is to ensure that low-wage workers in California have the power to advance economically. And that was a transition made under my leadership and with our current board, with a hypothesis that by being focused on one goal, we would have more impact in the grant making that we do. So we are all in on efforts to help skill up low-wage workers for better jobs, to help ensure low-wage workers get paid what they're due and get paid well enough to enter the middle class. And we're looking at issues of what it costs to live in California for low-wage workers. So we're looking at issues around affordable housing as well.
I'm visiting here today with Don Howard of the Irvine Foundation. I'm up against the break again, but when we get back, I want to go deeper into what you're doing on the social impact area with the Irvine Foundation. We'll be right back after these messages.
Grandpa, we found the golden stone.
We have to watch out for the treasure guardian.
Oh no, the treasure guardians!
Since you can't take your wealth with you, spend time with your family. GrowCo, servicing family office needs since 1964.
Welcome back. I'm visiting here today with Don Howard of the Irvine Foundation. Don, in the previous segment, we talked about how the Irvine Foundation became what it is today, and $2.5 billion of endowment, and what a vision James Irvine had, dying in 1937, but leaving this foundation that is still very active today in helping to lift those who are not as capable as individuals. I want to go back to this area. I'm gonna coin the term self-reliance of this lower income sector, and we're faced with a crisis in homelessness and housing costs, and Irvine Foundation is jumping right in the middle with social impact. How do you deal with this?
Well, we started with the observation that the California's working population, a tremendous number of folks are living in very precarious economic straits. Estimates are that about 40% of Californians live at or near the poverty level. And when you look at working Californians, we just commissioned a pretty broad survey. Close to 47% of workers identify as at or below their local, what it costs to live locally, not the national poverty rate, but a local cost of living. And that's not sustainable as a state. It's not morally right, and nor is it economically smart for us to be creating such a big divide and such a really an underclass in our state. So what we've gone about doing is really putting our arms around low-wage workers and listening to their needs, understanding the challenges that they're facing, and then making grants, what we consider to be investments in social change, in leaders and communities that are doing the best work, where they have evidence that what they're doing is making a difference. So we have one of our initiatives is called Better Careers. It's a $120 million commitment over 6 years to help strengthen and scale the best workforce development programs in our state that have evidence that they can put folks into living wage work. And in giving them large investments that are flexible and they can use as they need to, they can innovate to find ways to serve more folks more effectively and hopefully help lift some folks out of poverty and help those folks get into living wage jobs.
Don, as you issue grants to various organizations, how do you build accountability for what they've done with the money?
That's a great question. We've embraced accountability as one of our values at the institution, and our grant making is organized into these initiatives that where we have very clear goals for success, very measurable goals. And that's hard to do in philanthropy because a lot of social change isn't that measurable. But in our Better Careers initiative, which I mentioned, the grantees there have very specific goals of placing underprepared, underpaid workers into better jobs, training them, helping them get placed, helping them succeed in living wage work. So you can measure that. You can see a year after our folks in those jobs have their wages increased, et cetera. So we do measure that. We ask our grantees to report back on that. We also have a set of goals for each of these initiatives that is at a higher level, if you will, around innovation for the future, doing things cheaper, better, faster, and a set of goals around trying to scale the impact by affecting public policies. Nonprofits are really a small part of the workforce development system in our state, so the real impact will come from demonstrating better ways and embedding those better ways into public policies that govern the broader economy. So we have very clear measurable goals. We do also, and I think this is important to know if you're someone in the audience is a philanthropist or a budding philanthropist, we respect the leaders of those institutions to know about how to do their work in the best way. We also embrace the idea that the best ideas are outside the building. You hear that a lot in Silicon Valley. We're taking that into philanthropy. The leaders in these communities who run these organizations are closer to the problem. The constituents, the members of these groups are the ones who can identify what's working and what's not. So we give them unrestricted capital, what we call general operating support, so that they can invest to scale their impact on their terms, not through some ideas we might have from our vantage point.
I love it. And then that way it allows innovation and such to come through. With the foundation, first of all, how many employees are there?
So we have about 55 staff members between an office here in San Francisco, our headquarters, and a pretty significant size office in downtown LA.
And then you have in the San Francisco office roughly
about 40 of those 55 folks. We have our own internal investment office. So we have about 5 folks who are on an investment team. We have about 25 folks who are on our grant making team.
You know, so I have to ask this question. So James Irvine, Southern California, Orange County, headquarters, San Francisco.
How'd that happen, huh?
What happened here?
Well, Mr. Irvine's father made the family's initial wealth by selling hard goods to the gold miners. Not a story that's, it's a common story for some in San Francisco. I think of the Levi Strauss Foundation as a good example of this. His legal offices, the business offices of the family were always in San Francisco. It's where the lawyers were. It's where the accountants were. Mr. Irvine loved the ranch, which was purchased after his father's death. And he loved living on it and turning it into an operating agricultural business. So he spent more time in Orange County, but the family offices, so to speak, stayed in San Francisco.
When you look at the foundation today and on a year after year basis, do you have a lot of concerns in the nonprofit world is just funding other charities and trying to build accountability. How do you choose? How do you choose your partners?
So, we've set this goal of advancing the cause of low-wage workers. Within that, we've identified what we think drives, and there's a lot of evidence around this, a lot of good research around what drives economic mobility. So you need to be trained for a job that's a well-paying job. So job training becomes one of the areas we're investing in. So it's within that we then need to choose who are the organizations that we're going to invest in. And not too unlike maybe some of your venture capital colleagues, we have a due diligence rubric that we use. We do landscaping of the organizations. We run them through a set of analyses, and we try to surface those that we think have the greatest opportunity to make a difference and can do it at the most efficient way, and make grants to them. We do reserve, I think it's important to know, for some segments of California and some segments of our California communities, they're not well served by these bigger organizations. So if you're in Fresno, or if you're a returning veteran, let's just say, there may not be one of the organizations that passes our due diligence may not actually be serving you. So we reserve a certain amount of our grant making for organizations that are a little earlier stage or working with populations a little harder to serve, to make sure that we don't have the rigidity of a due diligence process mean that we are not able to serve everyone in California.
I got to ask, though, with all the things that you have going on, the social impact, I love the programs that you're working with and lifting those who need help the most. What are some of the most favorite organizations you're working with today?
Oh, it's like asking me to pick my favorite child. That's a little tough to do. Let me just point out a couple that I think are really impressive. Year Up is an organization many folks are familiar with. They help young folks who are disconnected from education and from work get back on track and train up do an internship and then get placed in a job. We've been providing considerable support. They have a great amount of evidence that what they're doing is making a significant difference, and they're doing it at a scale that is really impressive. There's another organization here in the Bay Area called Jewish Vocational Services, or JVS. They similarly have really figured out how to work with employers to place newcomers, particularly immigrant community members, into jobs in the Bay Area. The list could go on. We do have about 20 or so of these core grantees around workforce and workforce development. Let me mention one last one to just give you a little breath. The Center for Employment Opportunities works with people coming out of the justice system, helps put them to work initially in contracts they have with state organizations like the roads to do road work and such, but then with that base begin to train them up for better paying jobs and help place folks into work that can help them lift their families into the middle class.
With all that's going on, and there's great needs in society today, as we see driving by the freeway, all the people in tents. If a person has a cause and an organization, they say, hey, you're our answer. How do they go about contacting you? How do you want to receive things from?
Well, there's a couple things to know. If you are someone who has resources and you want to support some organizations, we publish all of our grantees and the focus of the grant on our website at irvine.org. And you can scan that for ideas on folks who you might want to support. We're not a grant-seeking institution, so we're not the kind of organization that could take somebody else's money. But I think the research and the due diligence and the help beyond the dollars that we provide these grantees makes them great investment candidates for others.
So, Don, when everything's said and done, how do you want to be remembered?
It's funny.
I'm switching this from a business to personal level.
Yeah, and one thing to know about me is I have twin sons who are 6 years old. And so I think quite a bit now about legacy, and I hope the lessons I can convey to them about service, about giving back, about making a difference, will stay on beyond my time and make a difference in our state and in our country. I sometimes find myself in despairing over the state of our world, and then I'm with my boys and I realize the potential they have to make a difference. I also spend a lot of time trying to make sure they know the privilege they have. My grandmother, as I said, came with $10 through Ellis Island, and my mom worked hard and I've worked hard. I want them to know that they have an obligation, again, to whom much is given, much is expected, to give back. And I hope they both grow up wanting to do that, but knowing that the resources they have are not, they're not evenly spread. Folks don't have the same lifestyle that we get to have, and that is all the more important for them to make a difference in somebody else's life.
I have to say, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on our show, Don. It's, I'm walking away from this thing here. I'm sitting across the table from an individual that has great educational foundation, could do anything they want in the private sector, but they chose a pathway in life of lifting and building the less fortunate. I really appreciate you being here today.
Thanks for having me.